Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I call this episode 3 Cases of Missing Time. I wanted to do this video because I think missing time is far more common than people realize. People will have what appears to be a simple sighting, and it's not until much later that they realize they had missing time. And what I have come to discover is that when someone has a close-up sighting within a couple of 100 feet, your chances of actually having missing time or deeper levels of contact go way, way up. Missing time is, of course, the #1 indication that you've had an on-board UFO encounter. And yet it can slip by very easily unnoticed. So that's why I wanted to do this video. And I've got 3 cases for you I'd like to present that I don't think you've heard before. So let's just get started. And the first case I want to talk about I call Missing Time on Grandview Drive. This occurred in 1961, which is actually the same year as the Betty and Barney Hill case. At that time, missing time in association with UFO encounters was pretty much unheard of. We certainly didn't recognize what it meant at that time. So that's significant, I think, in this case. This occurred on Grandview Drive in Topanga Canyon in Southern California, which is a major UFO hotspot. There were 3 witnesses, Beverly Smith and her 2 young children. There was Lisa, age 7, and Kim, age 5. They lived on Observation Drive, which is located pretty high up in elevation in the center of the canyon. And one afternoon, they decided that they were going to drive down to the local Fernwood Market. This is just a 20-minute drive from where they live. So they drove down from their home through the canyon and visited Fernwood Market, bought a few items, and were heading back up to their home. And some point on their way home, they saw something very strange. What appeared to be silver discs hovering not too far away, maybe a quarter mile, low in the sky in the canyon. All 3 of them saw them, and they decided to pull over and take a closer look. And they pulled over at the intersection of Observation Drive and Grandview, and took a closer look at these strange discs that were hovering in the sky. Beverly saw them first. She remembers there being 2 discs, and as she says, I saw these 2, what we referred to then as flying saucers or whatever, outer space things. It's over near where the park is. I saw these 2 things. It was right there. And so all of a sudden they came together and one just kind of sat down and stopped. You could see them really clearly, and it was just really strange. They were round, like the pictures you see these days. Round, similar to those tops that you push and spin, the old-fashioned spinning tops. The cone was on the top, and they seemed flat on the bottom. According to Beverly, these were bright silver and glinted brightly in the afternoon sun. She did not see any lights, nor did she hear any noise. But her young daughter, 7-year-old Lisa, also remembers this event clearly. According to Lisa's memory, there were actually 3 discs. And she's pretty sure about this because she remembers they were hovering in a triangular formation. As Lisa says, and I quote, "We saw these 3 objects in the sky, and to me, I remember them being kind of multicolored and soft. They weren't hard-shaped things. They didn't really have distinct edges. They were saucer-shaped, but they looked diffused at the edges, and I remember them being kind of multicolored, kind of pastel as opposed to primary colors. I don't remember them moving, kind of like moving, but just hovering each in place. They definitely appeared solid, but their edges and lights and colors were just diffused, almost like a fog was around them or something. Kim also remembers this event, even though she was only 5 years old at the time. She doesn't have quite as much detail as the other two, but she does remember at least one of these discs hovering and glaring brightly in the sunlight. As Kim says, and I quote, "We looked over on the mountain there, and on top of the mountain was a flying saucer. And it was silver and just hovering over this mountain. We all got out and looked at it. We were like, wow, look at this flying saucer. I felt no fear at all. We were just totally amazed. We just stood there, got out of the car, stopped, stood there, and looked at it. It seemed close. It didn't seem high in the sky and far away. It seemed close enough to see the details that it was a silver disc type thing, like the old type disc, silvery, round. That is what I remember." So the three witnesses stood there for at least 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes just watching these things. They were very beautiful. All of them were very much impressed. And at some point, something weird happened. They apparently had missing time. As Beverly says, and I quote, "The discs just kind of came together. And I can't say that they landed. They just kind of settled there. And all of a sudden, they just came apart and went off separate ways. One went one way, and the other went the other way. At this point, they decided that they were going to run home and get a camera and binoculars and see if they could see these things more closely, because one of them was apparently still there. And as Beverly says, it was so strange because I said, well, let's run home. Let's get in the bus and get home real quick and get the binoculars and look at them real good, see what's going on. So it was so strange that we got in the bus, I guess came home, but none of us remember coming home. And we didn't think about it until the next day. I don't know what time we got home or anything. It was really strange. So I just said, oh, we won't say anything about this because everybody will think we're crazy. Kim also remembers this weird missing time aspect, as Kim says, and remember Kim is the 5-year-old. We were going to get a camera and binoculars and come back to look at it, but we forgot about it until the next day. And when we went home, we didn't remember. It was broad daylight, and then that was it. It's Lisa who actually has a little bit more recall than the other two of what happened following this sighting. As Lisa says, I just remember standing there and looking at them. And as I was looking at them, my mom saying, let's go get the binoculars. I remember feeling like I didn't want to leave. You know how you feel like you might miss something if you leave? I don't remember getting into the car. We went home to get the binoculars, but we didn't remember to get the binoculars. I do remember somebody saying we had been gone an awful long time just to go to the store, and we couldn't figure out why. Nobody remembered about the binoculars until the next day. We didn't remember why we had gone home. I just remember somebody saying we had been gone 2 or 3 hours. I wouldn't say I remember coming home. I remember being home. I would put it that way. Do I remember the drive home? No. I remember the drive down the hill, standing at that place and looking at these 3 objects. It seemed to me there was a fight about how long we were gone between my parents. So it is clear that these 3 witnesses did in fact have missing time. But they don't understand what happened at the time. And again, back in those days, there was no correlation between missing time and onboard UFO encounters. So they didn't even consider that possibility until years later. But currently, they do know that missing time is a good indication that there was an onboard UFO experience. but none of them really have any desire to go under hypnosis. Beverly, the mother, doesn't talk about it much, but her kids, who are now adults, still remember it quite vividly and have considered hypnosis. As Lisa, who was 7 years old at the time, says, "For a time, I was interested in having maybe regressive hypnosis or something to see if anything happened to me. But since I didn't have any recurring dreams or apparent losses of time except for that time, I just decided that it wasn't worth going into, mostly because I have a sense of well-being and a good feeling about it. And since it feels that way, and since the reading I've done indicates that some people have pretty traumatic experiences, and that sense of well-being is put there to protect you, I think I'd like to leave it that way." Kim pretty much feels the same way. She's never really seriously considered hypnosis, and she doesn't really talk about it too much either. As Kim says, "It's not something I've told anybody about because nobody believes you. It's not something you go around and brag about. It was just something that we all saw and I'll never forget." So they kept it secret. They told no one except friends and family. And it wasn't until there was a huge wave of sightings in that area, Topanga Canyon, that they decided to go public. They called the local Topanga Canyon newspaper the Messenger, and that's how they were put in touch with me, and they agreed to be interviewed. It's a very interesting case of missing time. I'm pretty confident that they were probably taken on board, but hard to say. They have no dreams. They have no mysterious scars on their body that they can relate directly to this. But the fact that all three of them have had missing time indicates to me that, yeah, they probably had an onboard encounter. And now we move to the second case. The second case I call Missing Time in Malibu. And this occurred actually not too far away from the previous case. Malibu is right next to Topanga Canyon. And the main witnesses in this case are Robert and his wife, who owned a home in Malibu Canyon, right off Malibu Canyon, on a little road called Piuma. It was actually a street right off of Piuma, a dead-end street. This is a very rural area, quite a few homes there, but it's surrounded by wilderness. And again, this is a very active area when it comes to UFOs. And Robert had always been interested in UFOs, but his encounters began around 1975 when he began meditating. And one evening in 1975, he decided to sit down and meditate and concentrate on calling down a UFO. He wanted to see one, so he sat down and meditated and imagined bringing down a UFO. And to his shock, it worked like a charm. He says, following his meditation, he saw, quote, "a brilliant orange globe of light floating lazily towards the ocean." So this apparently opened the door to a number of other encounters, because he started having sightings fairly regularly after this. In fact, it was 2 months later he saw, quote, "a brilliant red ball of light." It zoomed overhead at about 200 miles per hour, he estimates. It was moving very fast, and he saw it for maybe 10, 11 seconds before it disappeared off in the distance. But it was just a short time later that he had another sighting. In 1977, it was 2 years later, he saw, quote, "a yellow-orange sphere." Again, it was in the same area over his home in Piuma. And this object was at very low altitude, low enough where he lost view of it behind some trees. It was a very brief sighting, just a few seconds, but he's absolutely convinced it was unexplained. So he had 3 sightings over a space of about 2 years, and this was when the UFOs came much closer, and he apparently had missing time, or a UFO landing involving missing time. This occurred in October of 1978. Robert had retired to his bedroom to lay down. This was during the afternoon, and he was alone in the house, just laying in bed. His bedroom has a glass door which overlooks the backyard. At any rate, he was laying down in his bed, just dozing and relaxing, when suddenly something strange happened. He heard and felt a very strong and intense low vibration. And as Robert says, and I quote, "I was completely paralyzed and could not even open my eyes until the vibration stopped." He's not really sure how long this went on, so there was a period of disorientation there. That's definitely a red flag pointing towards missing time. But at any rate, at some point it did stop, and he immediately jumped up and went all through the house looking for any indication of something strange, and found nothing. And he was pretty sure it wasn't a dream or anything, because it seemed so real. And it was a short time later, 2 days later, actually, that he got proof, or at least evidence, that something very strange had happened. Because he went out into his backyard and saw something that really shocked him. He saw, quote, "a lush, vibrant green, 17-foot diameter ring of grass about 8 inches wide." This was directly outside his glass sliding door outside of his bedroom. And as he examined the area, he saw something else which puzzled him. The tip of a 30-foot tall pine tree, which grew alongside his yard, had been broken. It was cracked and hanging down. So this was a pretty good indication to him that something bizarre had happened. And putting all the pieces together, this vibrational noise, his being paralyzed, the cracked pine tree, the ring of grass, it looked to him like a very large 17-foot wide object had come down and hovered over his backyard, or perhaps even landed there. And this mysterious ring remained visible. It slowly faded as the months went by, but after a year it was still faintly visible. And then the same thing happened again. It was now 1979, and Robert was again resting in bed when he had a strong impression that someone or something was standing outside his bedroom door, out in the backyard. And he was about to get up, but didn't. As he says, "I intended to get up and investigate, then woke up some time later and thought nothing more of it until later that week, when a second lush, vibrant green, 17-foot diameter ring of grass appeared on my back lawn, right next to the first one, which was still there." At this point, he became absolutely convinced that this was a UFO, and they had probably had missing time. Again, he saw no marks on his body, had no dreams. He has not elected to go under hypnosis, but it certainly made him realize that he has probably been taken on board a craft. He's probably a contactee. And his sightings continued. It was 2 years later, in 1982, he had his 4th UFO sighting of a red light that moved overhead. He saw it the next night, and the next night after that, 3 days in a row, but then it never returned. But it was 2 months later he had what he counts as his 8th sighting. So when someone has 8 sightings, I mean, this is another huge indicator that they're a contactee. He was outside, looked overhead, and was watching a jet go overhead, heading towards LAX, which is not terribly far from his home. He knows the flight paths very well and was just watching it go overhead when this weird green light sped up behind the jet and actually overtook it and zoomed off into the distance. He estimates this object was moving at about 3 times the speed of the jet. So that's many, many hundreds of miles per hour, perhaps up to 1,000 miles per hour. Very fast. And like all of his sightings, this object was completely silent, at least as far as he could tell. At this point, the sightings seemed to stop. Robert and his wife went on with their lives, but 10 years later, on May 12th, 1992, Robert had a sudden impulse to try to meditate and call down a UFO. So he and his wife did it together. They meditated together on seeing a UFO, and it worked. It worked like a charm. As Robert says, and I quote, "We both observed a brilliant incandescent white sphere suddenly appear while descending at a very rapid rate from about 7 to 5,000 feet. It appeared below a ridgeline without slowing down. It was super fast and again, totally silent." What's really interesting about this sighting, which occurred on May 12th, 1992, was almost exactly 1 month later, on June 14th, 1992, when there was a huge wave of sightings involving hundreds of objects seen by scores of people all throughout the Santa Monica Mountains. And this was the beginning of a massive UFO wave which swept through this area and lasted for well over 2 years. Unfortunately, at this point, due to financial considerations, Robert and his wife moved out of Malibu and up to Oregon, and their encounters pretty much stopped. So that's that case. It's a very interesting case involving missing time. And once again, the witness has no real memory of being on board a UFO, but it's pretty clear, at least to me, that that's what in fact happened. And now I want to talk about the third case, which I think is the most dramatic case. And I call this case Missing Time on Highway 5. The main witness is Keith Boyer. That is a pseudonym. And he had a friend along with him. They were driving from Los Angeles to San Francisco along Highway 5 in 1982. And they were about halfway between LA and San Francisco in the middle of the Central Valley, sort of near the Fresno area. And it was late at night, around 2 a.m. There was very little traffic on the road. They were moving at about a good clip of about 70 miles per hour. When looking ahead of them, they saw something very strange on the road. It was a bright, multicolored object surrounded by this weird, foggy mist. Now, Keith had always been interested in UFOs. He's read a number of books, so he was super excited. And he gave a really good description about what he saw. So I'd just like to quote Keith extensively and let him describe in his own words what happened. As he says, "I was driving through the Central Valley on Interstate 5, and I was approximately halfway between San Francisco and LA. I was with a good friend who is a very hard-headed individual, a firm pillar of the community type, not given to hysteria or anything. And I probably wouldn't tell you this story and wouldn't even be thinking about it a whole lot anymore if this guy hadn't been with me. But we were driving down the road, and sure enough, there was something strange hovering on the horizon as we were driving towards it. It appeared to be some kind of flashing light, something that was hovering over the freeway. Well, we drove along towards it, and, everyone drives through the Central Valley at 70 miles per hour. There wasn't a car behind us and not much traffic on the road at all, really. It was 2 a.m., and so the object was pretty indescribable from a distance. The colors and lights seemed rather striking, and the conversation turned to, "What is that?" "Well, it might be a plane flying along, and maybe it's a police patrol or something." "No, it's pretty bright." "Well, maybe it's a crop duster plane." So as this conversation progresses, we're heading directly towards this object, which apparently is 100 feet off the ground above the freeway, on our side of the freeway. And as we got closer to it, more and more details became clear. The object was a series of lights, seemingly merging and rotating into each other, with a kind of indefinable mist surrounding the object, a fuzzy atmospheric phenomenon. At this point, the conversation between my friend and I became extremely animated. And it was like, "Well, maybe it's a crop dusting helicopter." "No, that theory was rejected because there aren't any crop dusting helicopters that I've ever heard of." So we're continuing to drive over towards this object, which is now beginning to move over to the right of the freeway, but it is also descending. At this point, Keith and his friend hadn't felt any fear. They were just pretty excited about it. Keith always likes to drive, by the way. He will not get into a car unless he is driving. This fact will become important later. But I'll just let Keith continue describing what happened. As Keith says, "As we continued to zoom towards this object, the light became almost uncomfortably bright. Very odd colors, deep, rich blues, greens, yellows, reds, a number of them shifting and merging into each other. And this ominous-looking fog or mist surrounded the whole thing. It was hard to make out an outline of anything, so our conversation became extremely agitated at this point. As I remember it, constant, both talking virtually at the same time, comparing notes about what we thought this thing was. And as the object descended, and as we began to draw abreast of it, it was maybe 100 feet over the side of the freeway and landing, and it seemed to be kicking up dust, or maybe it was more fog or whatever the object seemed surrounded by. Fog or haze, a hazy mist, kind of cloudy white, kind of swirling tendrils of stuff. So at this point, I perceived that the object was unlike anything I could possibly explain rationally with what I know. And having spent years studying the topic of UFOs, it seemed clear to me that I was finally seeing a genuine UFO. And unlike what I thought my reaction would be, one of, "They do exist, yay, hooray!" I felt horror. This was something that seemed to me at the time that was not only reading my mind and knew everything about me, but I was no more than a bug to it. Maybe an interesting type of bug, but this is my perception of what the object was. It seemed to me that the object wasn't a spaceship, as almost something that was an entity unto itself. So my friend and I are continuing to observe this object, and as we draw abreast of it in its landing, my reaction was to get the hell away from this thing. I always thought my reaction would be, "Here is a very interesting thing that has befuddled hundreds of thousands of Americans and people all over the world, and I'm actually privileged to see one. Let's stop the car, walk over, and knock on the door." Instead, it was nothing like that. It was an odd and terrifying, bright object that was scary, and I wanted to get away from it as fast as possible, because with what I had read of UFO effects there does seem to be a rather harmful effect. Some people have been burned and have been affected negatively by UFO presences. So my response was, as I said, to get away. Keith is not quite sure how big this thing was. As he says, "It's hard to tell because the perspective of the object kept shifting and the light and the mist made for a very confusing effect. But if I had to make a very rough ballpark guess, I'd say maybe 50 feet across and 50 feet wide, roughly circular but oozing, changing, transmogrifying. It was a profoundly disturbing sight because it could not be explained by the brain. The brain kept trying to impose things like helicopters or airplanes as explanations, but there were no explanations. And that was when the shock began. Here was a completely inexplicable object. Disturbing. I mean, distressing. It bothers one. So they were pretty fearful at this time and just totally entranced and watching this object. And this is when they apparently had missing time. Because as Keith says, the next thing I remember, he, his friend, was driving. And at that point, a very strange phenomenon began happening. Instead of speaking to each other in English, we began babbling, speaking in tongues, it's been called. And it was a profoundly disturbing experience. It seemed right at the time, but there was also a part of the brain that was observing all of this and going, well, what the hell are you doing? So that continued for about 10 or 15 minutes. Afterwards, the effect seemed to slowly wear off, and we numbly continued our drive into the San Francisco Bay, where I lived. So after returning home, they did not discuss it. Not for some time. And it was about a year later that they finally mentioned it to each other. And this is when another very strange thing happened. As Keith says, and I quote, "Now we get to a very interesting thing. My friend told me about a year later about a beam that had come out of the object. And I had forgotten all about it, which is odd. But as one studies these things, one finds that there is missing time and so forth. But at this point, I don't remember any more than suddenly realizing that my friend was driving and I wasn't, which is odd, because I'm a very obsessive driver who loves to drive and always drives. And he described this beam that came out of the object and swept across the field towards us. Well, when he said that, I had a horrible memory of it. I remember neither of us wanted to get hit by that beam. But it hit us. At that point, both Keith and his friend blacked out when this beam struck their car. This is when they actually had missing time. And neither of them really remember what happened during this missing time. Though Keith did have a few flashbacks. As he says, it was funny. I was driving and then suddenly he was driving. I can't explain that, not very well. I seem to, I don't know, do I have memories of stopping the car and shuffling around? I don't remember. We were very upset. Both of us were very upset by the sight of the thing. So following this encounter, Keith did have a very strong reaction. It changed him profoundly. And in fact, it completely altered the path of his life. He quit his job. He left his girlfriend. He ended up going to school to pursue the profession he always wanted to do, which was being a disc jockey on a radio station. And he feels that this encounter, although scary at first, was ultimately beneficial because it really led to a huge spiritual awakening for him. And as Keith says, and I quote, "This is another thing that seems not uncommon when one studies these things. UFO encounters often change a person's life. In my case, it was for the better. So whether there was actually any effect, I can't prove. But I suspect that there was some kind of an interaction between the object and myself and my friend. And certainly at this point, I feel like the encounter was beneficial. But I remember feeling great horror and fear up to the point that I don't remember anymore, like an animal that was trapped and wanted to get away from a superior force that was incomprehensible." Keith did consider hypnosis, but as he says, "I've thought about it, but I don't know any hypnotist I can trust. I really am reluctant to pay some hypnotist I don't know how to hypnotize me. The whole effect of hypnosis to me, I don't trust it. So if there was someone I knew, someone recommended who was good, who could be vouched for, but right now I'm reluctant to tamper with it any further. To tell you the truth, I have a horrible feeling that there was more to it, and I really would like not to know about it. So this is an effect, a reaction that I've heard from many other people who have missing time. They're afraid of opening up a can of worms. They feel like their encounter was benevolent, and they're scared of what they might uncover. And that's certainly true in Keith's case. His friend, however, has gone much farther to try to not think about this. As Keith says, every once in a while, my friend and I get together and we'll look at each other and say, "What was that thing?" And the topic will change. Last I heard, Keith actually ended up moving to Hawaii and was living in a cave and stocking up food and preparing for, quote, the end times. He really believes, like many contactees, that our Earth is coming up for some major environmental disasters, and that people need to stock up food and water, and that there could very well be widespread loss of life. I hear this quite often, so I wasn't actually that surprised when I heard that this is how Keith has reacted to all of this. So even though he doesn't remember what actually happened during this missing time, when he was presumably taken on board, I suspect his reactions has something to do with this, that he was given warnings of environmental disaster, because that is the number one message I hear from people. So those are the 3 cases that I wanted to present involving missing time. And again, the reason I wanted to do this is because I want people to realize that if you have a close-up sighting within a couple of 100 feet, it's really quite possible that this is more than just a simple sighting, and that you have had missing time and were possibly taken on board. And yeah, again, this is much more common than people realize. I heard a quote from J. Allen Hynek that 1 in 40 people have been taken on board. And I think that's probably pretty close to accurate. That's what really got me into asking everyone I knew, have you had an encounter? And I didn't have to ask 40 people. And I found about 5 people who have had this missing time, including Keith. And it was a year later when the Roper poll, the Roper organization, found that 1 in 50 people have had an onboard UFO encounter. So I do think this is much more common than people realize, and that's really why I wanted to do this video, because this is something, this phenomena of missing time and being taken on board, I think is fairly widespread, and people should know about it. So that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I really appreciate you watching. Thanks very much. Hope you're having a great day, and until next time, keep having fun.